Hello, everyone. In this set of videos, I'm going to be talking about a topic which is very important from the point of view of an application developer and also from the point of view of the end user. The topic broadly covers the areas of privacy and security. So I'm going to start by first talking about privacy versus security. What are they? How are they different? And also, how are they similar? And ultimately, since this is a course on web application development, what are the implications for developers and what do you need to understand? The first thing is, what do we mean by privacy? By privacy, we generally mean certain kinds of personally identifiable information that is important to an individual who is using an application. And for you as a user, the main thing that you are concerned about is what rights do you have over your personally identifiable information? In other words, are you able to control access to it? Can you prevent others from using or misusing the information in any way? Now, privacy is primarily governed through regulations, and governments mandate what can be shared and collected. In many cases, governments may have certain rules, but it is quite likely that the private entities or the corporations that run certain applications or that run certain websites would have their own rules. The main reason is that when a corporation takes on collection of personally identifiable information, at some level, they are also liable for how that information is used. Which is why you will see that when on any application that you purchase or that you use, you will probably be signing off, maybe just by clicking on an I agree button on some kind of an end user agreement. It's sometimes called an end user license agreement or an EULA, but most of those also have things or some information about privacy. What kind of information is collected, what the application intends to do with it, how it is stored, what rights you have, and so on. Now, the main point about privacy is that for you as a developer, knowing about privacy requirements impacts what needs to be done by the developer in order to safeguard the privacy of the users of that application. Now, this is a couple of cartoons that indicate what we used to think of as privacy and what it sort of relates to now. This is a cartoon that came in the New Yorker magazine in 1993 and was a humorous way of essentially presenting what was new about the internet at that point. And it's about two dogs sitting in front of a computer, and one dog is saying to the other, on the internet, nobody knows you are a dog. And that was the whole point. I mean, one of the promises of the internet was the fact that people could be themselves without having others judge them based on how they looked or how tall they were or whether they had an accent when they spoke. Everyone could just be their own nature, right? Unfortunately, that's not really the case now. And there was a follow-up cartoon. In fact, this was part of a talk by Richard Stallman as part of the GNU project in 2014, roughly about 20 years after this original cartoon, where you have a dog sitting in front of a computer and seeing advertisements for bones and a dog bowl and a dog toy. And the dog is absolutely flustered, thinking, how did they find out I'm a dog? Right? So this is just a humorous way of putting across what is actually a much more serious problem, which is the fact that even though in principle you might think that you are not revealing much information about yourself on the internet, there is a lot more about you that actually gets out through the various actions and the websites that you browse. Now, all that was regarding privacy. The second part of it is security. How is the data that is being collected by an app actually safeguarded? So this relates to actual physical implementation measures. How does the application store and manage the data? And unlike privacy, which is usually regulated through rules, in the case of security, it is more a question of good coding, following security best practices, monitoring infrastructure. In other words, this is much more the part where the developer plays a role. This is the part that you need to know how to implement correctly. So a couple of questions that come up in this context. One of them is, does it make sense to talk about privacy without security, right? That is, can you say that, I will just keep my data private. I don't need to bother about security. And one simple way of actually thinking about that is just don't reveal any personally identifiable information. anywhere online, right? If you don't give out any data, there's no chance of anything leaking. The problem is, the moment you want to sign up for a Gmail account or a Facebook account, they ask you your name, they ask you for an email address, they ask you for some information. You might give fake data over there, but increasingly it becomes difficult because at some point they need to verify whether you are over 18 years of age. So they ask you for your date of birth. They need to identify in which location you are so that they can provide services that are specific to that location. If you don't provide it, they'll probably cut off a lot of information that is useful to you, right? So it at least severely restricts the kind of activity that you can use, and it doesn't work very well in practice. More importantly, you can end up leaking data even if you don't give it out, right? For example, there's an app called Truecaller, which runs on phones and can be used to essentially look up who is calling you, right? Now, the way that this works is if one person signs up for Truecaller, it more or less uploads their list of contacts to the Truecaller site, and it's forming a sort of collective database in that way. Now, what that means is Truecaller knows my name, even though I have never used Truecaller, because somebody else who I know has entered my name in their contacts list and uses Truecaller. So they know that this phone number corresponds to this name, even without my ever even having heard of Truecaller to start with. There was a much more serious version of this, which was the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which came up around the 2016 elections in the United States. And what happened over there was several 100,000 Facebook users installed an app called This Is Your Digital Life. The problem with that app was it also started collecting information about their friend networks, and ultimately revealed quite a lot of information about nearly 80 million users, more than 80 million users of Facebook, even though the majority of them had nothing to do with that app. This, unfortunately, was a serious scandal because the kind of information they collected and the uses to which they put it were very problematic. Truecaller does not have any such issues, at least that we know of, but the very fact that they can collect such information becomes potentially a privacy issue, since you don't have control over what information is given out. Now, on the other hand, you could also have highly secure applications, but which don't have any respect for privacy. In other words, the application itself might be very well constructed. It has good infrastructure for protecting data. However, the end user agreements don't mention anything about keeping it private, and in fact might explicitly have some clauses that allow the collected data to be shared with others. Now, at some point, you might wonder, okay, what's wrong with sharing that data? But it might not really be in your best interests. Very often, the most common place where this happens is in the context of advertisements, because advertising agencies are ultimately interested in maximizing the impact of an advertisement. So they want to know who are the people who are interested in certain kinds of things so that they can have targeted advertisements. They can show ads to people who are likely to buy something. Now, a word about sensitive information. Very often people don't have a clear idea of what this personally identifiable information is or why something should be considered sensitive. Certain things, of course, are fairly obvious to most of us, right? We naturally think of if we have a password, then it should be kept fairly safe. Similarly, my online banking information, account number, and so on should probably be kept safe, although even that is a bit questionable. There are quite a few people who, if you just go and directly ask them their bank account number, will probably give it to you saying, okay, what can you do with my bank account number? And in fact, there you might even think that, okay, I don't have all that much money in my account, so even my PIN is not really a secret, right? But the problem is, once you have the bank account number and the PIN, there is a lot of additional information that can be collected about you that can be problematic. Another place where we have direct sensitive information is in the case of medical records. If you have some kind of medical problem and you do not want it to be publicized, then you definitely do not want your medical records to be public information or to leak out. Now, a bigger problem in some sense is what's called indirect sensitive information, right? You have probably seen on any of the e-commerce websites, whenever you go and purchase something, you see a link, or even just look at something, you see something under it which says customers who bought this also bought, and so on, right? Now, what that means is the site is keeping track of related purchases, but it is also building up a model of what you are likely to be interested in, which is why you will start seeing more and more recommendations to buy something along those lines. Similarly, you might find that if you order pizzas, right, after a while, the recommendation engines are getting so smart that they decide, okay, maybe it's time for you to get some exercise, and you start getting recommendations for exercise and gym equipment. Okay, you go to LinkedIn, the job oriented website, and you might start getting job recommendations based on the kind of profiles that you are visiting. Now, all of this, you have not really registered on LinkedIn looking for a job. You have not really asked for gym equipment. And perhaps you're just browsing an e-commerce site without necessarily intending to buy something, right? But the metadata, right? Information about information in some sense, right? That's why it's called metadata, is valuable to the end application developer, right? Because it sort of increases the chance of keeping you involved with the system. Now, there are a number of regulations that relate to privacy protections. One of the biggest sort of landmarks in some sense was the so-called GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which was introduced by the European Union and is required of any entity doing business in the European Union. Now, you have probably noticed that in the past few years, pretty much every website that you go to has a banner over there saying this site collects cookies or collects information or sets these kind of cookies. Part of the reason for that is because of the GDPR. It made it clear that any information, including any cookies that are being set or collected, have to be reported to the user. The user must be given the option of opting out, in other words. Okay. Similarly, there are other regulations. In the United States, there is something called HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It protects the privacy of patients and health plan members. And one of the main purposes is to ensure that the health information is kept secure. And importantly, patients are notified of breaches of their health data. In other words, if there is a leak and somebody is able to get information, at the very least, the person concerned must be informed that this has happened. Now, most of these regulations are country specific and are domain specific. So HIPAA, for example, is only related to medical information. And the country specific, GDPR is basically only for the European Union. The point is, if you are developing an app, you have to be aware of relevant regulations. You cannot really claim lack of knowledge. If you build an app for medical record storage and you are then trying to market it in the United States and it is not HIPAA compliant, you will probably just lose certificate, you'll not be able to get certified. You won't be able to sell the product. More importantly, if you actually start collecting that information and then you are found to be in violation of HIPAA compliance, you are probably going to be held liable. So you need to be aware of the regulations in the area where you want to operate and follow those. Now, regarding security measures, the regulations that we have seen so far specify what needs to be protected, but not how to protect it, right? So in general, as an app developer, what are the things that you need to do? One of the things is you can reduce the chances of leakage of private information. The simplest thing to do is don't collect information in the first place, right? And an example of this is what you see in the messaging applications, WhatsApp versus Signal, right? WhatsApp is one of the most popular applications that we have today. It's used for messaging directly from person to person or between groups, right? And they have a number of features that make the usage very convenient. So one of the things, for example, is that the messages are stored on their servers. And until maybe a year or so ago, they did not even have the so-called end-to-end encryption, right? Now, WhatsApp does implement so-called end-to-end encryption. And what they say is that the message that you have is pretty much visible or readable only to you and the person you sent it to. And there are standard protocols by which this is done. A large part of this push came about because of the app Signal, which explicitly right from the beginning said, this is what we are going to do. We do not want to know what the message is between you and the end user. We do not have an unencrypted version of that message. And in fact, Signal went to the extent that they said, look, we don't want any additional information about you. You are signing up using your phone number because that's what is convenient. But beyond that, we are not going to really have anything. We are not going to store your messages, even in an encrypted format, so that if it comes to a data leak, there is literally no chance of your private information being exposed, even in an encrypted format. So many applications, so as you can see, WhatsApp also started taking up many steps in this direction, although they do store more information, much more information about you than an app like Signal. So in general, as an app developer, there are a number of best practices that you need to follow. Right? There are certain measures that you can take at the front end with regard to in-browser security, and a number of other measures that you can take at the back end on the server side. And as a developer, it is important that you are aware of all of these techniques and try and follow them to the extent possible. As your application becomes more complex, this becomes more and more important, because you will not be able to expand or reach out to a larger number of users without ensuring that such things have been taken care of properly.